The Old Man and the Forest. I love extreme recreation. Once I gathered an expedition of 12 people, and we, having collected all the necessary provisions, set off on our way. At the edge of the forest, we met a talkative old man. We decided to stop for a camping. No one has ever gotten out of this forest, neither alive nor dead. Even during the blockade, an entire village went into this darkness, escaping from the bombing. Apparently, another misfortune overtook them. Although salvation in the forest was quite reasonable, there was no food then, but you could live for weeks on berries alone. But not there. The old man thought about something, and we sat as if bewitched, waiting for the continuation of the story. At that moment, it was as if we were not listening to the silence, but it was listening to us. Then voices began to be heard from the forest. He continued. Someone recognized their sons, mothers, brothers in them. They ran headlong to help, and they knew that they would perish. Well, what would you do if you heard a cry for help from someone you love? We thought about it. Oh, the old man drawled, that's it. But they weren't thinking. They were just running. You shouldn't have come here, guys, but if you hear anything, don't move from your place. You'll last until the morning, and then I won't let you in. The old man barked angrily and wandered off to a low house behind us. A kerosene lamp was burning on its porch, giving us some sense of safety and comfort. We settled down in our tents. In the morning, I was awakened by a jolt. What are you sleeping for? Get up. My friend's frightened face appeared in the opening of my tent. There's something there. Hurriedly dressed, I left the tent and saw a group of guys standing there. They were actively discussing something, gesturing with their hands, pointing towards the forest. What happened? I asked in a sleepy voice. Look, said my friend and pointed towards the forest. What I saw was difficult to describe. The wall of the forest, or rather the part that was closer to us, had moved apart. That is, the trees formed a huge letter V. He is not there. We went there, checked, someone said. I think he. Before I could finish speaking, muffled shots were heard from the forest, like from a gun, only from before the war. That was exactly what the old man had. Everyone stood in a daze. Everyone at once remembered his words, don't move from the spot. It seemed that the beating of the heart drowned out the sounds of the wind in the ears. What was strange, the birds did not sing. I immediately remembered the previous night. There was not a single mosquito, not a single cricket that would disturb this silence. And now, another shot, closer, followed by a wild, chilling roar. It was so close that it seemed to be hidden only by a small group of trees standing like a wall in front of us, as if the forest was releasing something. Runner! It didn't matter who shouted. Before I could even come to my senses, I was running among the entire crowd, and seeing the faces of those who turned towards the forest, which reflected genuine horror, I was already cursing the day when I had assembled this damn expedition and the will of chance that had brought us to these places. The next moment, the ground under my feet began to shake, as if under the stomping of a huge, heavy monster. My heart was jumping from my throat to my heels and back again. The trees behind me began to crack, as if some violent force were breaking them. When you know what you're dealing with, it's much easier to assess the situation. But we didn't even know where to run and what exactly we were running from. At that moment, the old man's house to our left exploded into splinters, debris, glass and broken furniture were flying at us. Some people fell to the ground, but no one waited for anyone else. Everyone was saving their own skins. What would you have done? Look! Someone screamed through tears. Pushing the branches aside, I saw the following picture from the forest, the edge of which was about 100 meters from us. Either vines or roots were very quickly stretching out, roughly speaking. They were some kind of dark green tentacles. They deftly wrapped themselves around those poor fellows, lying down, and just as quickly dragged them back into the forest. They were no longer screaming, they were probably unconscious or, "Yeah, I've never seen anything like this," said a familiar voice behind us. The same old man who had disappeared stood with his gun at the ready and looked at the guys who had just been dragged away by the forest itself. "You?" my friend asked with sincere amazement. "We even calmed down a little when we saw him. Get up. We have to leave." "But what about? And the things?" "Our things are still there." The tearful girl started to wail. Grandfather leaned over her. "Listen, little one. Do you really think that when you get to your tents, you'll still be alive?" "No, this is all a bad dream," I thought. I started to slap my cheeks, pinch them. But no, of course, it wasn't a dream. Having come to our senses a little, we followed the old man away from this place. Tonight, for hectares of forest burned outside the city limits of N. According to the assurances of the fire brigade that arrived at the scene, there is no threat to the city. It is reported that the fire was most likely caused by a lightning strike. The old man finally found a way to end all this. Mr. Gillespie preferred never to deal with travel agencies when he traveled abroad, which happened quite often, for he was a very wealthy gentleman and adored all sorts of adventures. He invariably planned his own routes, using railway timetables and all sorts of reference books and guides, which were almost his reference books. Unfortunately, it also happened that his plans failed, like this time, for example, when the failure turned out to be completely unexpected. He was traveling in the southern part of Europe and, as luck would have it, got stuck on the road. The taxi, if you could call the hired car that, was standing forlornly at the side of the road, hopelessly stuck in deep mud. The car's engine had long since died, and the bewildered driver kept scratching his head in confusion. Mr. Gillespie once again glanced irritably at his watch. It was 12:30, and if he was serious about getting to Zagreb, he had to be in Munich no later than 6. He climbed out of the decrepit car and, finding himself under the rays of the bright sun, which had finally appeared in the sky after several days of continuous rain, immediately began to sweat stickily. After all, he was already in his 70s, and besides, his corpulent build was clearly telling. He really wanted to talk to the driver, but he did not know the local language at all. Then Mr. Gillespie pointed his finger at the stalled engine, then pointed to his wristwatch, clearly making it clear that he wanted to know when they could continue their journey. The answer came immediately, not earlier than 2 hours. Mr. Gillespie sighed resignedly and looked around, although there was not much to see. To the left of the road, a dense, dark forest towered like a solid wall, while to the right, a precipice yawned, stretching beyond the cliff. The shade from the trees beckoned with its refreshing coolness, and so the hapless traveler took out of the trunk of the car a travel bag in which he always carried his painting supplies, threw it over his shoulder and was about to leave. To Mr. Gillespie's obvious surprise, the driver began to hold him back with strange fervor, motioning for him to stay put. With a hand damp with sweat, he grabbed his thick wrist and quickly chattered something in his own language, at the same time looking anxiously into the passenger's eyes. Mr. Gillespie involuntarily felt irritated, shook his head and made another unsuccessful attempt to express himself in English. Then he confidently moved towards the forest. The driver shouted something after him again, but he did not even turn around. Soon both the car and the driver disappeared from sight completely. Now he was surrounded on all sides by the forest, a little mysterious, a little eerie, partly friendly and in some ways impersonal. In the end, Mr. Gillespie began to think that the forest was quite benevolent towards him. True, quite soon he noticed its unusual silence. Not even the singing of birds was heard, although this silence rather suggested to him not so much a hidden hostility as a good disposition towards his own person. He also noticed that the forest was still rather strange. There was no undergrowth at all. There were no fallen leaves, branches, or other forest debris anywhere. There were no thickets of bramble, only soft, smooth green grass growing between even and orderly rows of trees that seemed to be artificially planted. Mr. Gillespie was not a botanist and therefore had no idea what these trees were called, although their shade did indeed have the most beneficial effect on him. Bright rays of sunlight broke through the dense crown of the trees, falling in uneven yellowish spots on the lush green grass. As an amateur artist, he could not help but appreciate such a pleasing to the eye range of colors. Coming out into a small clearing, Mr. Gillespie found a convenient stump for sitting, which was almost closely adjacent to one of the trees. In this place, the sun's rays falling on the ground had almost no obstacle in front of them from branches and leaves, which made all the colors seem brighter, richer, and created a charming play of light and shadow, falling in an even layer on the soft green grass. Mr. Gillespie slowly took a palette and paints from his bag. It was easy and even pleasant for him to work, his head slightly thrown back, and obedient fingers deftly moved the brush across the sheet of paper. After a while, he nevertheless vaguely felt that, despite all its natural charm, this whole scene was deprived of some important element. For some reason, he wanted to see a little boy in a red jumper at the base of the tree. Looking slightly to the side, Mr. Gillespie literally jumped up in amazement. There really was a little boy sitting near the tree, calmly looking at him. True, he was not wearing a red sweater, but a rather strange outfit, vaguely resembling a sack, with a slit for his head, which barely covered his dirty, thoroughly scratched knees. Otherwise, there was no doubt this was indeed a small boy of flesh and blood. The boy curled his lips, showing his snow-white teeth for a moment, after which he stood up and fearlessly walked towards Mr. Gillespie, stopping a few steps away from him. Slightly lowering his gaze, the artist noticed with disgust that the child was clutching in his palms the bloody remains of some small animal, either caught in a trap or prey to a larger predator. Catching his gaze, the boy grinned again and threw aside the terrible, bloody rags of meat, and then slightly stretched out his lips, threw his head back a little and let out a loud, drawn-out whistle. A moment later, the astonished Mr. Gillespie saw 3 more children emerge from behind the trees, 2 boys and a girl, very similar to the first, dark-skinned, with shining eyes, tousled hair, and dressed in the same baggy rags. The children silently looked at the stranger. The first to emerge from the row was a girl approaching Mr. Gillespie. She extended her hand and unexpectedly squeezed his leg just above the knee. Apparently, the result of such an inspection was quite satisfactory to her, since she immediately went over to her friends and said something to them in a quiet voice. They laughed excitedly, opening their mouths wide and flashing their cheerful, shining eyes. Mr. Gillespie was clearly feeling insecure. On the one hand, he felt a certain embarrassment, finding himself under fire from 4 pairs of attentively looking eyes. On the other, he felt obvious annoyance at being unable to talk to them. Instead, he only smiled at them. Their expressions did not change at all. Then he took his unfinished sketch from the easel and showed it to them. Then he suddenly remembered that he had a bar of chocolate in his bag. He quickly unzipped it, took out the delicacy, broke off a small piece and put it in his mouth, in case these poor ragamuffins had never seen anything like it, and handed the rest to the girl. The scene that followed was so wild that Mr. Gillespie stood for some seconds as if struck by lightning, not knowing what he should do. First the girl sniffed the bar of chocolate, bit off a piece and began to chew it intently. At the same moment, the boy sitting next to her snatched the chocolate from her hands. She, naturally, rushed at the offender with a squeal, so that in a few seconds both small bodies were intertwined in a fierce, almost mortal struggle. The children rolled around on the grass. "Stop it!" Mr. Gillespie, who had finally come to his senses, exclaimed sharply. "Stop it right now." It seemed that no one even heard him. The boy continued to squeeze the girl's throat with both hands, while she scratched his face with her nails. Mr. Gillespie could not stand it and, grabbing the boy, abruptly pulled him to his feet, involuntarily amazed at the force with which the child was tearing himself out of his hands. Suddenly he fell silent, somehow went limp, but the girl laughed triumphantly and dexterously jumped to her feet. Then the four of them stood around him, clasped their palms, forming a kind of living, dirty brown ring, and, laughing merrily and throwing back their heads, began to run around the astonished man, stamping their bare heels and seeming to involve him in some kind of wild dance. Everything swam before Mr. Gillespie's eyes. He fussed, jerked from side to side, trying to break free from the living ring, but the children's little hands clung to him every now and then and held him firmly in their captivity. At last he managed to break through their encirclement. He immediately sank to the ground, wiping the sweat from his forehead and trying to calm his desperately pounding heart. Meanwhile, the children again formed a semicircle, and, looking at them, Mr. Gillespie involuntarily was amazed at the fact that they seemed not at all out of breath and not even tired, while he still could not catch his breath. At some moment, he again felt a sharp squeeze of his leg just above the knee. This time it was a boy. And again the children exchanged some words. True, now none of them laughed. They all silently and tensely peered into his face. Mr. Gillespie thought that it was time to return to the car. He rose with difficulty, feeling his legs buzzing from the unaccustomed running. The children continued to stand motionless in place. And again the girl came forward, slightly stretching her lips. She stretched out her palms to him, as if hinting that he should take her in his arms and kiss her goodbye. Mr. Gillespie was clearly touched by such a scene. He picked up the child, and the child actually clasped his little arms around his neck. And at the same moment the man felt a disgusting, some kind of animal stench emanating from her unexpectedly opened mouth. Her greenish eyes looked straight into his nose. Suddenly the artist felt a fit of bottomless, chilling horror. With a sharp cry, he tried to free himself from the grip of the children's hands clinging to him. Soon he was already screaming long and wildly, almost howling, while the blonde head continued to bend lower and lower until her lips reached his throat and white teeth sank into his soft flesh. And then 3 pairs of tenacious fingers grabbed him by the ankles, jerked him sharply from the unexpected attack. Mr. Gillespie staggered and fell heavily on his back. Now all 4 of them jumped on his chest, stomach, legs. For some time he continued his desperate but useless resistance, even screamed loudly a couple of times, but then he fell completely silent. A few minutes later, all that could be heard on the silent clearing was the abrupt clanking of strong, young teeth. Lost in 3 Pines. The story is not very scary. Such cases are told quite often. But this story was told by my grandfather. So for me this story sounds real. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side lived in Latvia on a farm, 7 kilometers from the regional settlement of Veselki. This settlement arose in time immemorial, when old believers were exiled here or they themselves fled from persecution by the authorities. And the area there was remote, like parties in Belarus, swamps, black forests, gullies, windfalls, wild boars and wolves. Well now, of course, it is not the same. What was the farm? A large, wooden manor house and numerous outbuildings, sheds, storerooms, cellars, barns, a barn, a pigsty, a poultry house, vegetable gardens, fields, and all this is surrounded by forests. The fields were huge, no mechanization, hard labor. My grandfather and grandmother worked together. The hardest work was done by the brothers, who lived in the same farms beyond the fields, beyond the forests, several kilometers away. The children, my mother and aunt, also had their own responsibilities, very difficult for their age: cooking, washing, cleaning, collecting brushwood, mowing hay, grazing small livestock, sheep, geese, and a million other things. They had to walk 7 kilometers to school, in winter, in waist-deep snow through a dark forest. In general, life was not easy, even very. Mom told me that in winter, in the dead of night, wolves would come, stand on the porch, and look into the windows. The cattle would go crazy with fear. Then the Soviet power came, and my grandfather shrewdly and voluntarily gave all the land and animals to the collective farm and joined it himself. That's how he avoided dispossession. Then, the war, my grandfather went to the front in the first ranks because he was a communist. And my grandmother had to pull the whole farm and the children herself. The fascists showed up, and the forests were inhabited by ASICs, forest brothers, like our banderites, that is, partisans. Grandma was hung twice. They scared her into revealing where the partisans were hiding. The partisans and fascists sometimes raided the farm and took away food: bread, leg of lamb, eggs, whatever they could find. But Grandma never protested or contradicted either of them, and so she survived. Auntie was sick with typhus. Her hair was cut, and after that it grew curly. They wanted to take Auntie to Germany, but Grandma bribed the village elder, and Auntie's age was reduced in her birth certificate. Having lived through all this, Grandma never complained, but told everything with some optimism, even with laughter, like an interesting fairy tale. She kept a smile until the end of her life. She was an amazing person. May she rest in peace and eternal memory. Grandfather returned from the war as an invalid, tuberculosis. Thanks to his grandmother's care and periodic hospital treatment, he lived long enough to see his grandchildren. But he was no longer capable of hard work. And in the end, tuberculosis finished him off. Getting off topic, I want to tell you about a small mystical incident that also happened to my grandfather. My grandfather had a favorite cat, Kotya. When he lay exhausted on the stove, the cat usually lay on his chest. When he was taken to the hospital in Daugavpils for the last time, the cat started crying at night. Grandma crossed herself, also started crying and said, "My Izotka is gone. He died." My grandfather's name was Izot Petrovich. And so it turned out. After that, the cat howled all the time, and then left the house. So don't tell me that dogs are loyal. My grandfather grew up and spent his whole life in these parts. He knew every forest down to the last path, every swamp down to the last hummock. But just imagine, he got lost in 3 pines. He never admitted that he got lost, but stubbornly insisted that the wood goblin was playing a joke on him. An old man walks through the forest, and walks, and the boletus mushrooms are one more beautiful than the other. The old man's nose is buried in the ground. He straightens up, his back aches, and look, holy mothers, where am I? All unfamiliar places. He goes along a clearing thinking, I'll come out on the highway like this. But the clearing suddenly became overgrown. He goes in the other direction, the road ends in a swamp. The old man spat in his heart and stomped straight through the forest. He walks and the forest gets darker and darker, the trees get thicker and thicker, and moss hangs from them. Black firs, 2 spans wide, their lower branches form a tent, and in that tent someone is fiddling and snorting. The old man got scared. He probably thinks it's a wild boar, a terrible animal, strong, aggressive and very fast. The old man, no longer thinking about the road, trotted out of there as quickly and quietly as possible. He ran a little, caught his breath, sat down on a fallen tree. He thought about it, couldn't understand how this could have happened. He got lost in his native forest, which he had walked and walked through. Wherever he turned, there were impassable thickets, windfalls and spruces, thick as baobabs. Under the shade of the trees, the sun was almost invisible. Only a weak yellow spot shone through. He started because he had fallen off a log in his sleep. How long have I been sleeping? He thought. He figured no more than an hour. The sun had set slightly. The grandfather looked around, chose a direction to move in. He went. He walked, but there was no light in sight. It got dark, and the sun had risen higher. The grandfather got scared, looked, and it was the moon. Apparently, he had slept longer than he thought. Finally, the forest seemed to thin out, and lights began to loom ahead. The grandfather was as happy as a child and ran towards these lights. He realized, I went to Potapov's farm, or to Griever. I went too far. I'll spend the night at my brother Potap's. I don't have the strength to get home. And Potap always has some homebrew ready. These are the plans he makes. And, inspired by these plans, he runs without looking. Suddenly there was a squelching sound under his boots. He looked and saw a bare swamp all around, and the lights had disappeared. The old man began jumping from hummock to hummock and wandered into a quagmire. He hesitated, got water in his boots. As soon as he pulled the boots out, he sank waist deep. The old man began to rush about in panic, but remembered in time that twitching and rushing about in the swamp was like death. Then he slowly lay down on his stomach and began to pull himself out of the swell. The swamp did not want to let him go, squelched, gurgled, snorted and even rumbled like a sleepy water nymph. But the old man defeated it. He crawled up to a small island where a crooked, dead tree stood and dry grass grew. He lay face down for a long time, overcome by belated fear. Then he sat up and saw that the lights had appeared again, so close and warm in appearance. But the old man only showed a fig in that direction and added a couple of curse words in a frontline manner. He decided to wait until dawn and not to wander around the swamp at night under any circumstances. He reached to take off his boots and looked. There was only one boot left. The swamp had taken its toll. The old man took off his boot, wrung out his foot wraps and hung them on a tree. He lay down on the dry grass and did not exactly doze off, but rather seemed to freeze. The swamp seemed strange to him, very quiet. Not a night bird would cry out. Not a small animal would rustle. Very quiet, like in a well. It began to turn grey. The old man looked. Sure enough, the swamp was unfamiliar, dead. Usually in their swamps there are various plants, grasses, a lot of water birds, animals and reptiles. There are also whole fields of cranberries, where it is drier, lingonberries. And here, nothing but dry long-haired grass and dry trees. And between the hummocks, dead swamp lakes, stinking like I don't know what. And what struck Grandpa to the depths of his soul, here and there the grass was braided into pigtails, as if someone was playing. By the way, Grandpa said that night lights were creeping up on him from all sides, as if luring him, as if testing his strength. What if he couldn't stand it, and went towards the light? But Grandpa, like a true communist, only extended his invariable fig in that direction and whispered various indecent expressions. When it got light, the old man put on his shoes, broke off a large piece of dry wood and went to clear a swamp. So, from hummock to hummock, sometimes falling through, he swept quite a lot. He looks. An inviting island looms on the course. High, dry. He needs to rest and catch his breath. The old man looks. A twig is stuck on the island, and a red rag is tied to it. He is happy, thinking that someone left a note on the right way. Suddenly the old man sways. He feels sick. Black rags dance before his eyes, and his head is blown, so he became like a drunk. With the last of his strength, he goes to the island, the red rag before his eyes as a landmark. The old man approaches the pole. He was just about to grab hold of it, when suddenly the red rag barks like a fox and runs across the swamp. And the old man runs in the other direction, runs and curses the devils at the top of his voice. Either the famous Russian mother helped, or God pardoned him, an old sinner and soldier. But the grandfather did not drown in the swamp, but jumped out onto a high place. From there he saw cultivated fields and someone's farm. Already missing to boots, the grandfather hobbled to the farm and thought, "Whose house is this? It seems familiar. I'll go ask kind people to show me the way home. I must have gone very far from home." He comes closer, looks, and this is his home. He entered the house, no one, sat down on the porch and rested. Suddenly, he sees a crowd of people running and his Maria in front, bareheaded. They ran up, stopped, gaping at him, and the grandmother threw herself on the grandfather's chest. "Izotka, Izotka, where have you been? The whole world has been looking for you," everyone screamed. "Didn't you hear your name?" That's how the goblin led my grandfather. After that, my grandfather was very ill from overwork, but he drank mead regularly. With his son-in-law, that is, with my dad. Over the mead, my grandfather would tell this story every time, always embellishing it. My father would say to him, "Dad, aren't you ashamed? You're an old Bolshevik, and you believe in the devil. You just breathed in the swamp, and it's all just a figment of your imagination." My grandfather would get very angry and, beating his chest, would prove that everything that happened to him that night was true, including the devils. He couldn't have gotten lost so easily. He couldn't have failed to recognize the area, and there had never been such a swamp there before. And the shining lights. He would cry out, "A swamp rotten thing," they would answer. And the running red scarf. "So Dad, only in Germany are devils red, and here they are black, as it should be. Pierfew on you, let's have a drink." That's how all the arguments ended. After the feast, Grandpa would go to bed, and Daddy would put on a sheepskin coat, tanned inside out, and go to the village to scare the people. He couldn't stay at his mother-in-law's without jokes. And my grandfather, may he rest his soul, was convinced for the rest of his life that he had entered into a confrontation with evil spirits and emerged victorious. Sing quietly, I am your fear. I was born and raised in the city, but over time I realized that it is almost impossible to live here. Concrete monsters, the roar of engines, the bustle, the grey dull landscape outside the window, almost destroyed green areas. The urban environment is becoming aggressive. There is no place for simple human happiness. You feel completely different in the village. You can arrange your house as you want. If you want a veranda, a winter garden, a terrace, please. You don't have to share the yard with impudent neighbors. You arrange the adjacent territory to your taste. Here you have a garden, a vegetable garden, a flower bed, a sandbox, a hammock, and a sports ground. You can calmly do your own thing. It is much easier to live in nature, since you don't have to go somewhere specially or go down from the nth floor. You go out and already walk. I spent my childhood in the village. Every summer I spent with my grandmother Toma. There I met Olia, my friend for the summer. Now I remember with increasing intensity how we fooled around and had fun. We played in the fresh air and summoned different spirits, like the evil gnome, the Queen of Spades, and other semi-fairy tale evil spirits. My soul becomes light from warm memories. And now I'm going to my granny again. She's already quite old. I haven't seen her for so long. When I arrived, my granny greeted me with an open heart, with pies and fresh milk. I also found out that Olia was here too. Of course, I decided to meet my old friend. When we saw each other, The whole village heard our cries of joy. We spent 3 days together. Each of us told us about our lives, problems and joys. But still, we city girls got a little bored. Elisa, you know, I just had an idea, my friend suddenly said. Do you remember the creepy legends about the local forest? They say that all sorts of mysticism and all that stuff happens there at night. I don't believe it, but I'd like to go. Just for fun. It's dangerous to wander around the forest alone, but it's perfect with 2 people. Imagine, it's such an adrenaline rush. And take your camera. It's good that you have a flash. We'll take some atmospheric photos. For a long time my friend tried to persuade me to this frankly dangerous idea, but I agreed. I never believed in mysticism, but I love to read horror stories at night, sitting at home in safety. I would like to experience something like that, to savor the feeling of something secret and unknown, even if it is just an illusion. We agreed to meet at the mulberry tree and head into the forest. 0:30. As soon as we went behind the first trees and the light of the lanterns was left behind, only the dark silhouettes of giant spruce trees and the forest darkness were visible ahead, my whole body went cold. My soul froze in a tight lump, and my legs, as if wooden, refused to move. My guide crucified my arms and made me open my soul to nature, inhale the spruce scent, trust the forest as my home. After that, my body came out of its stupor a little. I was able to move my legs further. It was clear from her face that she had been enduring this for a long time. Olga quickly thrust the camera and flashlight into my hands and disappeared into the bushes. A minute passed. 3, 5. Hey, will you be there soon? I shouted, but no one answered. Your mother. This is not funny. Come out. I whined angrily, knowing Olia and her jokes. Finally, I began to hear some sounds that I initially attributed to my friend, but I was wrong. Behind me, someone began to sing, no, even sang. In chorus, the song sounded loud and ringing in the empty night forest. It felt like a lot of little children were singing. The lyrics were not clearly audible, but the music was cheerful. This kind of music can be heard at children's parties. I walked in the direction from which the song was coming. My head was completely foggy. It seemed that these voices were the best thing that had ever happened in my life. Such feelings are difficult to describe in words. You need to feel it. I timidly picked up the words of the song, although I had never heard it. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. I repeated these words to the children's music and walked forward. The words seemed so naive to me, like a creepy children's counting rhyme, but at the same time the singing voices literally enchanted me. I wanted to scream and run away, but I couldn't. Something was controlling my body. No one was possessing me, but my actions weren't voluntary either. I wanted to wake up and understand that it was just a dream. A terrible and stupid dream that was better forgotten. And at the same time, I wanted to follow the sound of children's voices, merge with them in choral singing, clearly pronounce the words and forget who I was. Luckily, for some reason I stopped and felt my body. But where was I? It seemed like I was standing in the middle of a small clearing surrounded by trees. I felt like I had to run, but where to? Upset and tired, I squatted down like a thug. I was too tired, and my head was spinning as if I was drunk. What should I do? Tears were running down my cheeks. I scolded myself for agreeing to participate in Olga's adventure. By the way, where did Olia disappear to? I hope she simply got scared and ran home. After sitting like that for about 5 minutes, I took the camera and started clicking the trees that stood in front of me. It was very scary, so I had to distract myself from my own thoughts in such a strange way. Yes, it was not the best thing I could do, but at that moment I needed at least some actions and sounds, in addition to my breathing and the fear that was literally suffocating me. After taking about 10 pictures, I began to cry and look at the photos in some despair. Trees and grass, very interesting. The same thing again, and trees again. Stop. And what is this? Damn. For a long time I could not believe what I saw in the photo. Oh, this picture. A woman was standing among the trees. She was dressed in some kind of white rag. Her face was not visible. Only a small outline of her lips and nose could be seen if you looked closely. Her hair was dark, just below her shoulders. And that was not the scariest thing. Children were climbing on her. Little children. Babies. There were many of them. They were pale, translucent and thin. And they were all crawling towards the ghostly woman. Close your eyes and sing quietly. I'm behind you, behind your back. Something hissed disgustingly behind my back. I jumped up abruptly and ran as fast as I could. The fatigue suddenly disappeared somewhere. I didn't even think about looking back. I just ran wherever my eyes looked. I knew that it or they were running after me. I had no more strength. But I kept running and running. Frozen tears in my eyes, and my heart was pounding hard, echoing in my ears with an unpleasant ringing. But I was lucky. I ran out to a small highway. Houses were visible in the distance. Having caught my breath a little near the lantern, I ran again towards the village. When I arrived, the first thing I did was look at my watch. In the morning, I found out that Olia was just joking and hadn't come to the forest at all. In fact, she wouldn't have dared to go alone, but if there had been a group maybe. She slept peacefully all night. Olka hoped that I would get scared and run home, afraid of the dark and the forest. Yes, my friend just wanted to joke, which she wasn't very good at. And I, naive, bought it. When I got home, the first thing I did was transfer the photo to the computer and showed it in private messages to some friends. Naturally, they didn't believe me. They accused me of a prank. I still don't know what it was. Sometimes in my dreams I return to the forest and hear the ill-fated song. Only there I'm not a lost soul in the dark wilds, but that same woman. But I'm not singing to my many children. No. I'm singing to those who are looking for adventure in the night forest. Believe me, if you look for them for a long time, you can certainly find them. Alone in the taiga. There are two ways to get to those protected areas. Fly to Norilsk, then to Dudenka, then by helicopter to the village of Tukhart, then by hunting trails, sometimes by motorboat along the river, and sometimes on foot for several days of travel. Or, if you are an unusual guest, rent an all-terrain vehicle and rush from Norilsk directly. No matter which route you choose, you will still have to wander through the taiga for several days. And in that area it is deadly, wild. A seemingly safe place may turn out to be a swamp, so it is stupid to go there without a guide. And it is dangerous to be alone, even with all-terrain vehicles, 300 kilometers from the nearest village. Although there is almost nothing to be afraid of in the taiga. Animals, if you do not intrude on their lair, prefer to stay away, and people rarely appear in those parts. I myself have only been there by chance. First, we walked along the route with a drilling team, reconnoitered, so to speak, the road to the deposit. And then I talked one local old-timer, Grandfather Isay, from the Inganesen people, the indigenous inhabitants of this wild land, into going on a hunting trip. Grandfather refused for a long time, muttering all sorts of nonsense about Hisco evil animals. However, but for a couple of bottles of white vodka, he agreed to become my guide. Although it is difficult to judge who helped whom, the grandfather was old and frail in appearance, but he knew the surrounding forests perfectly. We got ready quickly. We went out in a motorboat, walked along the river to the south for a day, then walked for a long time through the channels. In the end, we left the boat on a hillock, dragged it so that the current would not wash it away, and went on foot further west into the swamps. A wonderful hunt. The animal is not afraid. Just load your gun and shoot at it. So by the end of the second day, we had collected a decent amount of trophies and decided to return. Old man Isaac got worried and suggested not to spend the night in the forest anymore, but to go to the motorboat without stopping or resting. It was unclear where the old devil got his strength from. I was at the limit of my capabilities. Then I involuntarily believed the men's tales that Isaac was the last Indonesian shaman and could do what others could not. But I didn't dwell on it then. I decided to simply agree, although man proposes and the tiger disposes. I didn't understand what had happened, but we didn't make it to the boat before dark. Grandpa was almost hysterical. He was yelling at me in a language other than Russian, swearing at the vodka he had agreed to take me here for, and he was almost crying. I felt ashamed. I beg you to forgive me. And he just snorted and looked around. Suddenly he grabbed me by the belt and with such inhuman strength dragged me somewhere behind him. It felt like an hour had passed. When the forest parted, we came out to an abandoned hut. Hunters build such huts to hide from bad weather, snowstorms. A small hut made of solid timber. Instead of windows, there were loopholes. The door was small and low. It was dry and warm inside. Isaac literally dragged me inside and began feverishly locking the door. He piled everything that was inside the hut against it and plugged the loopholes with rags. I look at all this and go stupid silently. The shaman doesn't say a word and is clearly preparing for something. It was already dark when Isaac sat down opposite me to catch his breath and lit a single torch to light a cigarette. He smokes and looks into my eyes, and I stare into his eyes, thinking, Isaac is testing me for some reason. It would be better if you were afraid sometimes, though, so you wouldn't end up in such a mess, Sonia. Not another word. Time passes, nothing happens. The old man sits hugging his carbine. I begin to doze off. After all, stress and fatigue have taken their toll. And through my sleep I hear a knock on the roof, as if a child ran by. The steps are brisk and light, but definitely heavier than a squirrel or a marten. And then a whistle came from behind the door and another knock, but louder and with pressure on the door. Sleep vanished, and Isaac put his finger to his lips, shaking himself and showing me, like, sit quietly. And so on for half the night. Creaking, knocking, whistle, an uncomfortable feeling, as if they were trying to scratch you out of your shell. Then everything suddenly stopped, but we still didn't fall asleep. And during the day we immediately went out to the boat. It was a kilometer from the place where we spent the night. I'm not interested in what came to us at night, because I don't want to go there anymore. Very quiet hunt. In the Leningrad region there is a village called Lopukinka. There is a left turn before the sign. The road ends at an old military unit. I don't know if it is still active or not. There are different rumors. There is a forest on both sides of the road. Many people go there to pick mushrooms. So, before reaching the unit, there is a high voltage line that crosses the road. There are mushroom pickers leave their cars and go on a quiet hunt. It is difficult to get lost there. The entire forest is divided into squares by clearings. The village is just a stone's throw away. And I have been there many times. Everything was great. But this time, everything went wrong. I, a grown man who has been in the forest 100 times, realized I am scared. The fear was creeping up more and more, as if my back was covered with ice. I wanted to turn around and run to the car, but I held back, trying to calm myself down. It is daytime. It is light. I am not some kind of weakling. I have a knife in my pocket. Who and what can do to me? With these thoughts I move on. Strangely enough, there are no mushrooms at all, not even toadstools. This is strange for these places. Then I saw a man in uniform, who was sitting on a fallen tree, with his back to me, and looking into the depths of the forest. The eerie feeling of unreality of what was happening began to grow even more. Who is this man? What is he doing here? Why doesn't he turn around at the sound of footsteps? Hundreds of questions in my head. I came closer, no reaction. He was sitting there, not moving. I walked around him, decided to look at him from the front. I was clutching the knife in my pocket, just in case. A kid, about 18 to 20 years old, in camouflage, was sitting and looking into the forest, not blinking, like a statue. And then I realized what seemed so strange about him. He wasn't breathing. Neither his shoulders nor his chest moved from inhaling or exhaling. And his gaze was glassy. And then the guy turned his gaze to me, and only his eyes moved. His head remained in the same position. Here I forgot about the knife, and about the fact that I was a healthy man. I forgot about everything. I ran from there to the car as fast as I could. I don't remember how I reached the road. It seemed to me that I was jumping like a saga through the windfall and other obstacles on the way. I flew out onto the asphalt and stopped dead in my tracks. My car was gone. That's the place. I couldn't get it wrong. There's my cigarette, but lying where I threw it. And the car is gone. Then I finally panicked. Something was there, in the forest. The car was gone. What to do, I have no idea. I thought, it's not far to the village. I need to get out of here, and then everything else. In general, I would have passed the cross-country running with flying colors, even with the strictest coach. I ran to the village, knocked on the first house I came across. An old man came out. I told him everything as it was. The old man grinned, started his jalopy. I don't understand how it started at all. I thought it was scrap metal, and offered me a ride. I agreed. We were driving for a very long time. I asked the old man why. It turned out that I hadn't run to Lopukinka, but to another village, 7 kilometers from there. And then I realized with horror that the old man had turned right in the direction I had come from. Then my gaze fell on the road ahead. I finally stopped understanding what was happening. My car is standing in the same place where I left it. The basket is lying nearby, in the same place where I threw it when I ran out of the forest onto the road. And the cigarette, but here it is. Grandpa, noticing that I had turned quite white, reassured me. You haven't gone crazy. You're not the first to encounter something incomprehensible in these parts. And you won't be the last. He told me that a few years ago, a young man from this military unit hanged himself in the forest. Since then, he has been seen often, and cars often disappear like this under high-voltage power lines. And he, this grandpa, has already brought 3 people, including me, here this summer. And everyone thinks that we didn't get lost for long and ended up in Lopukinka. I thanked my grandpa, got into the car, and drove home. I don't go there to pick mushrooms anymore. And it doesn't matter that I'm a grown and strong man. I am powerless against what I encountered that time. A friend of mine recently moved out of his parents' house and into a small apartment. We live in a small town, but the rent is outrageous. And it's a miracle he found a place for only $300 a month. Plus, his landlord lived out of state and didn't bother him. The apartment had 2 rooms. One was a bedroom and living room, the other was a dining room and kitchen, and there was a small bathroom off to the side. The friend who rented the apartment is Josh, my other friend is Grant, and I'm Dylan. It all started last week. Grant picked me up after work. He wanted to show Josh's new apartment. We got there, and Josh started telling us everything and showing us around. He showed us the kitchen and a small storage room, the bathroom, and then the dining room, which was separated from the kitchen only by a bar counter and 2 Walmart bar stools. He then showed us the bedroom, where we saw a mattress on the floor and a dresser pushed up against the closet door. I thought it was weird because it was blocking the door, but heck, It's not my place to tell a friend how to decorate an apartment. We decided to go out for dinner to celebrate the move. When we got back and Josh opened the front door, the lights were out, but I clearly remember them being on. We grabbed some popcorn on the way and were about to watch a movie, but when we entered the bedroom where the TV was, we noticed that the dresser had shifted. It was now sticking out slightly from one corner. Josh's demeanor instantly changed. He became nervous and asked us to leave. We said goodnight to our friend and headed home. The next day was Saturday and we decided to go back and see how Josh was doing. I knocked on the door but he didn't open for some reason. We knew he was home because his Jeep was in the driveway. About 20 minutes later, he finally let us in. He looked like he hadn't slept, his hair was tousled, his eyes were red, and there were sweat stains on his shirt. Grant and I figured he'd invited a lady over and they'd had a wild night. We were sitting in the kitchen and Josh went into the bedroom to change, and when he took his shirt off I could clearly see the bruises and cuts on his back. We played Mario afterwards. Josh apologized for throwing us out the night before. I told him it was okay and he could have just said he was waiting for a girl. He seemed confused. "What makes you think that?" he asked. "Well, where else did you get the scratches on your back?" I asked back and paused the game. He was confused and acted like he had no idea what I was talking about. Josh walked over to the mirror and lifted his shirt. He saw bruises and cuts and was shocked himself because he had no idea where they came from. We were a little scared by this development, and I said that he probably fell out of bed in his sleep and didn't remember it. Then I noticed that Josh kept staring at the closet door. Finally, he stood up and said he wanted to show us something that had been scaring him since he moved in. Josh moved the dresser aside, opened the closet doors, and there were his clothes inside. He pulled them out, and we saw a door. It was painted to match the wall, and there was a red rope tied to the doorknob. You could see the heads of 4 bolts on the top, holding something on the other side. Josh said that someone lived there, on the other side of the door, and these people had been coming into the apartment when he was gone, because he had come home several times already and seen things out of place, and food was disappearing from the refrigerator. What do you think we decided? That's right, we decided to open that door. I went to the garage to get some tools, and we got to work on it today. The door gave in easily, but to our surprise there was nothing behind it. Or rather, there was a brick wall. Before dark, Josh moved into a hotel, and we helped him move his things. He emailed the landlord that he would not be renewing his lease for the next month, and immediately began looking for other rental options. I drove past this house on my way back to my place in the evening. The lights were on in the windows of this strange apartment, although I clearly remember that we turned them off when we left. They say that in our city of Yakutsk there are a lot of ghosts, especially in the area between the bus station and the regional hospital. From time to time, scary stories are told about a bossy, restless shamans. I didn't believe in ghosts. Absolutely not. Not even in Casper. And I just laughed at such stories. They didn't make any impression on me. As a child, I also told scary stories about a black hand and a coffin on wheels. In a creepy whisper, I always said that all this was for real. And one day, my impenetrable materialism couldn't stand the test of life and started to leak. It was like this. I urgently needed to rent an apartment. And so one small family turned up. Well, you know, probably those houses that look like an anthill, 9 floors, stuffed with apartments. The Lilliputian footage is quite enough for one person, and the crowds didn't bother me, then a student. Moreover, this small family apartment was almost in the city center. From the window, you can see the church, such a pastoral landscape, and it was cheap, like in a fairy tale. It was rented out by a young family, who for some reason preferred to live not there, but with their parents, which is strange in itself. I should have been wary here. Besides, I knew that that micro-district was built on an old cemetery, of which only that very church remained. But, carefree and contented, I moved into the apartment. The only property was a folding bed, a table and a couple of chairs. I settled in, painted a funny hair on the bathroom door with watercolors, hung curtains. In general, I tried to create coziness. One strange thing came to light. The apartment windows faced south. That is, in the summer it should be simply scorching. But in fact, even on the hottest day, it was cold, like in a crypt. On the very first night, I woke up from a terrible snoring under the folding bed. I thought, what audibility! It's the neighbors breathing through the wall. And only in the morning, I realized that there are no neighbors behind this wall, but there is a street, because the apartment is on the corner. And the closest neighbors are across the room, the kitchen and that same bathroom. That is, their snoring could not be heard under any circumstances. I was surprised. That's all. A few days later, I was even more surprised. At night I heard the patter of bare feet, as if a child was running. I woke up. The water was making noise in the bathroom, and wet children's footprints were appearing on the floor. They appeared in a chain and immediately disappeared. To say that I was swollen is to say nothing. I could not think of any other explanations except that it was a dream. So I turned away and fell asleep. And in the evening, when the nights became dark by the end of summer, a real horror rolled in. For some inexplicable reason I became scared to the point of shivering. I began to sleep with the light on. Soon the light broke. I called electricians. They fixed the wiring. The next day it broke again. I called electricians again. Soon they were coming to me 5 times a week. I am not exaggerating. I was angry. What kind of craftsman are you? I say, can't you fix it once and for all? The wiring breaks in a different place every time. They make excuses. And then a friend of mine stayed with me for a week. After the first night, she said, "Yes, should I sprinkle the apartment with holy water or something?" The taps were opening and closing by themselves all night and the child was running around the apartment. It's scary. And how do you live here alone? And there was a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, naked, without chandeliers or lampshades. So, as soon as Zhenya had spoken out, it fell. The cord it was hanging on snapped in the middle, as if someone had pulled it with all their might and torn it. When the electricians came to fix it, they laughed that Zhenya and I were probably swinging on that cord like monkeys. We immediately went to church, got some holy water and, while saying our Father, sprinkled the entire apartment, every wall, every corner. And you know what? It became easier to breathe. For about 3 days. For 3 days there was silence and beauty. The light didn't break, the water didn't open. No one snorted or stomped around at night. And then it all started again with renewed vigor. And the rest of the holy water in the cleanly washed jar became covered in mold. By the way, I checked. My mother has been drinking holy water from the tap on Epiphany for many years now and it hasn't done a thing. When Zhenya left, it became impossible to stay in the apartment at night, especially in the kitchen. It was just creepy to go there in the dark without any apparent reason. So it all ended like this. One evening, I forgot my bag in the kitchen. I didn't go there for it by nightfall. And in the morning, I found a print of a child's palm, missing one finger. The print couldn't be washed off by any fairies. I didn't spend the night there anymore. I quickly rented a room, moved my things, and gave the keys to the owners. By the way, they didn't even ask the reason why I was running away from their apartment so quickly. We live in the information age, an era when it is difficult to hide anything. Naturally, this makes most people believe that we know almost everything about our Earth. But I want to prove that this is not true. What happened to me cannot be explained by science and is not described in history. I think I am the only survivor, the only one who was allowed to slip away. It happened last month. I like to walk in the forest near my house. I do it almost every day, so I know everything around me well. I am also a photographer. I like to take pictures of the places I visit during my walks. I want you to understand, I know this forest better than anyone else in the area. If you move a stone, of which there are many in the forest, I will notice it. So there is no way I could get lost. One day during my walk I decided that I would return home by the picturesque route. It was approaching sunset, and there was a place from where you can watch it and take pictures. I usually do not listen to music during my walks. I like to listen to birds, crickets, the rustling of leaves in the treetops. Today was an unusual day because I didn't hear anything. No birds, no rustling, no crickets, nothing at all. I knew that when nature was silent, there was a predator nearby, probably a coyote. I thought to myself. I picked up my pace a little and walked for about 5 to 10 minutes before I realized that I still hadn't reached my destination, which was strange. Plus, it was getting dark unnaturally fast. I knew I couldn't have made a wrong turn because it was a straight route. Then I thought about it and decided that it would be better to turn around and come out on the other side of the forest. I would go into town, catch a cab and go home. As I turned around, I heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes nearby. I decided not to pay much attention to it, thinking it was a small animal, and continued on. A few minutes passed, and I realized that I couldn't get to the right place again. This scared me a little, and the oppressive atmosphere of silence only increased my fear. I took out my phone and dialed one of my friends. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but can you hold the line for a little while?" I asked. There was no answer. "Are you there?" I asked again. And then I heard a strange sound. I don't know how to describe it exactly. Like a hiss on the other end of the line. I was completely scared. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. Yes, it was a stupid idea, but at the time, I couldn't think of anything better. I ran until I was physically tired. I stopped and fell to my knees. After catching my breath, I looked around and realized that I was deep in the forest. I was completely lost. I nervously scanned the tree line, trying to see some landmarks to figure out where I was. It was then that I saw what looked like a silhouette of a man standing between two trees. At first, I didn't notice him, but then the moon rose right behind him. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out details. He was about my height, wore a white shirt, and had dark skin. A relaxed expression, a slight smile, and the index finger of his right hand pressed to his lips, as if he wanted to calm me down. The moon hung motionless behind him, and then my thoughts began to fill with thousands of words. But they were not our words, not human words. I remember each of them, but I cannot pronounce a single one. He did not move, and neither did I. I wanted to run, but I could not. I do not know if it was because of fear, or because he did not allow me to run. After what seemed like an eternity, I was able to turn around, preparing to run as fast as I could, only to not meet him face to face. Not a single sound was heard, not even my own breathing and pounding heart. His eyes were full of mocking confidence, as if he were trying to say, "I know a secret that you will never know." And then there was a hiss. The blood in my body ran cold. It hadn't occurred to me until that moment that he could make sounds. I took a step back and realized that something was moving behind him towards me, and as it got closer I heard sliding sounds. Up close I saw that it was two hands, two incredibly long hands, reaching out of the darkness. They passed him and stopped right in front of me. One hand was pale as the moon, the other was pitch black. Both hands opened and stopped. I looked at the figure, which remained motionless, its finger in the same position. I had the feeling that it wanted me to choose a hand. I stood there thinking, wondering what would happen if I chose the wrong hand. In the end, I decided to choose the black one. I pointed at it, but he didn't react. So I tapped the hand lightly, and at the same moment they both recoiled into the darkness. The hissing sound came again. Suddenly, everything became incredibly loud. I could hear all frequencies at once, even those that are inaccessible to the human ear. I had never experienced anything like it. I tried to cover my ears. He leaned over and didn't even move his mouth. But I heard a voice in my head, "Don't forget, never forget." And then the sun set, and I was there. I walked out of the forest, where I had planned all along. I don't know why he decided to let me live. I don't know who he is, or how I ended up with him. I don't know what would have happened if I had chosen the other hand. All I know is that I don't go into those forests anymore. Dear guest, I once had a chance to work in a logging brigade. They paid well, and most importantly, the prospect of spending several months in the dense forests seemed like a real adventure and a challenge to the comfortable way of city life. I didn't have a specialized specialty or special skills at that time, so they took me on as an ordinary laborer. Due to my youth and inclination to fantasize, ordinary life situations seemed mystical and fatal to me. I returned home, being sure that I had witnessed a number of inexplicable events. However, as my critical thinking developed, a logical explanation was found for almost all cases. One of the exceptions was, for example, this case. As expected, the day was spent in labor. My muscles ached. Since they were not ready for heavy physical exertion, gloves did not save me from blisters. After a short rest, I went to buy groceries at a 24-hour store in the nearest settlement. My turn had come. This was my first trip outside our, so to speak, camp. I didn't know where exactly to go, but I nodded my head understandingly when they explained. That's why no one thought it necessary to go with me and show me the way. It was hard to get off the route for the first 2 or 3 kilometers. The tracks led in one direction. The light soil was broken and rutted by heavy logging trucks and dump trucks, whose tires left wavy scars behind them. It was getting dark when I set off, and soon it was completely dark. An orange moon with bloody veins rose into the black sky and accompanied me. On both sides, the forest seemed to be moving closer and getting ready to swallow my mud-spattered SUV. I dove into one of the turns. The path there turned out to be narrow. The tree branches reached the side mirrors and even the windshield. On the ground, the grass grew wildly and was nowhere crushed by a human foot, much less by car wheels. There was no doubt that no one had driven here for a long time after I stopped in front of a log blocking the road. Rotten, slimy, overgrown with moss, a large anthill towered at the place where the tree had broken. It was impossible to turn around and go back. There was only one thing left: to clear the way. Putting on gloves on my hands and wrapping myself in a raincoat bees could settle in the rotten tree, I got to work. The log turned out to be damp and heavy. I barely managed to lift it, as it immediately slipped out of my hands. After considerable effort, I managed to drag it off the road. Cursing myself and my frivolity, I continued on my way, regretting that I had gone anywhere at all. My muscles, tired from the day, began to ache after exercising with the log. The calluses on my hands burned my skin. However, this cluster of 12.5 houses could hardly be called a village or a hamlet, more likely some kind of settlement. That's what I thought when I left the car near one of the closely spaced houses. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that the huts were not in the best condition. They were all very slanted, and the logs were dark grey. The window frames had not been painted for a long time, and the glass was covered with a layer of dust, which is why the light from inside seemed dim and cloudy. Around lay troughs, leaky basins, a scythe with a rusty knife, and other household utensils that had fallen into disrepair. Silhouettes kept flashing through the drawn curtains. Music was playing. As soon as I raised my hand to knock on the door of the hut where I had left the car, the lights went out in all the windows at the same time. It became quiet. I felt eyes on me from the windows, gaping with black emptiness. I shuddered from the unpleasant sensation and immediately understood why this place was not like any rural settlement I had been to. There was not a single dog here. Every yard should have a dog. The presence of a dog in the house or in the yard instills peace and security in its owners. And these settlements, located right at the thicket of the forest, would not hurt to have guard dogs to protect from animals, or from people like me, only malicious. And who knows from whom else. I was already getting ready to get back into the car and drive away. I did not notice the grocery store, of course. When the lights came on in all the windows at the same time as they went out, the music started playing again. The door opened and a loud voice came from it. "Come in, dear guest." I turned around and saw a pretty, rosy-cheeked hostess in the doorway. A bearded man approached her from behind, flashed his white teeth, smiled broadly, and invited her in as well. Only if the guest doesn't mind that he'll have to wash during the third steam, and at midnight too. Being a city person and uninformed, I didn't even understand what he was talking about. Of course, I didn't refuse the bathhouse. I decided to stay the night here and go back at dawn. I'll tell you how it is. I got lost and couldn't find my way. From the outside, the bathhouse matched the houses that surrounded it, just as dilapidated, shabby, and slanted. But from the inside, it even seemed bigger. A cleanly swept and washed dressing room, smooth, light logs of the walls, a comfortable bench for resting. It is not easy to imagine this when looking at the external appearance of the building. I undressed and opened the door to the steam room, from which a hot, humid air blew. Covering my eyes with my hand from the steam, I went inside. The chafed skin of my hands immediately began to tingle painfully. When my eyes got used to the temperature, I removed my hand and saw the mistress of the house, who was sitting on a bench. Her hair was loose. She was completely naked. She noticed my confusion and smiled slyly. I embarrassedly said something in justification and hurriedly left, closing the door. How did she get here faster than me? After all, I left the house alone. The owners remained. "Dear guest, where did you disappear to?" Her voice rang out. Not knowing why, but I opened the door to the steam room and went in again. Only this time, the owner himself was sitting on that very bench, grinning with white teeth from under a beard as black as coal. I didn't see any doors in the room, or any possible holes either. The glass in the window was intact. The frames were nailed down. How could they have ended up here, and where was the mistress now? Without thinking twice, I slammed the door and ran out of the dressing room onto the street. Silence. Only the wave-like trills of the crickets made at least some sounds. The lights were still on in the windows of the huts. Then I walked around the bathhouse and didn't notice any openings through which one could get inside. The fragrant steam, relaxing, drove fatigue out of the body, returning vitality. I poured cold water on the dry, hot bench and lay down on it, inhaling the hot air, smelling of resin and wood, with all my lungs. I think I dozed off. After a while, I jumped up from a burning pain in my thigh, as if a red-hot firebrand had been pressed against my skin. Having examined my leg for a burn, I made sure that the skin was not damaged. There was no doubt that the pain was real. I decided not to hesitate any longer, to wash up quickly and leave here. Meanwhile, the bucket of water, which was heating up on the hot stones, began to bubble. Putting on a thick glove, I took the bucket. When it reached chest level, I saw in the reflection of the boiling water a huge black figure behind me, raising an axe above me. The bucket crashed to the floor with a crash, scalding my legs. Out of my mind with pain and shock, I rushed towards the door. Steam from the spilled water filled the room, spreading out like thick morning fog. Unable to see anything in front of me, I stretched out my hands to where the door should be. Attempts to open it with my foot or shoulder failed. Only a little steam dissipated, and I saw that there was no exit from the steam room. There was a solid wall all around. Rushing to the window, I tried to break the glass first with a stool, then with a poker standing by the stove, to no avail. Only ringing laughter was heard on the other side of the window. Judging by the stomping, several people had gathered in the dressing room, pouring logs onto the floor. The firebox door creaked open. The flame hummed, receiving a new portion of firewood, which was rammed into the stove to capacity. The metal walls of the stove and the laid-out stones turned red before our eyes. The stove puffed, absorbing hot coniferous wood. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. The air was getting hotter. It was getting dark before my eyes. The bathhouse tilted and floated. Feeling a barely perceptible light coolness on my back, I backed away from the blazing stove, lost my balance on my trembling legs, and landed on the floor in the very corner of the bathhouse. Air was seeping between the gaps in the boards, which I had not noticed before, and yet a palm could easily fit through them. "Hey, are you there?" I heard a familiar voice. With the last of my strength, I managed to answer the call. The next thing I remember, how I woke up already on the street. Next to me stood a guy from the logging team, a resident of one of the surrounding villages. Looking around, I saw that the light was coming only from the headlights of a car. The settlement was in darkness. There was no light in any of the windows. The same with this damned bathhouse, it's dark. When I didn't return for a long time, the team got worried. You never know, I'm young. I don't know the way yet, and in the dark. They regretted letting me go. This guy volunteered to go after me. No one knew the area better than him. Seeing the smoke from the chimney rising above the forest, he realized where I was and went straight there. They said that the reason for this was that several families were engaged in shady dealings, hobnobbing with evil spirits and bringing trouble to the respectable residents of the village. So, having gathered, they resettled them by force. Several generations of emigrants lived separately, but did not particularly bother anyone. Then, as they said, they all disappeared at once. They could not leave. Such a group would have been noticed. They went into the forest. But why? But people did not want to interfere in their affairs. If they disappeared, then they disappeared. I didn't ask about what happened there. It was probably more peaceful that way.